Welcome back. In this module, we'll discuss the need for a vCenter server. We'll speak a bit on the different vCenter server versions, as well as we'll talk a bit on the different deployment types that we have for the vCenter server. We'll start off this discussion by giving an overview of the purpose really of a vCenter server. This vCenter server serves basically as a central management console, and we use this for managing our hosts and our VMs. So it's basically that proxy for managing our hosts whilst we add them as members to our vCenter server. We'll see later some of the much more advanced feature of vSphere are only available once we add our vCenter server in place. Some of these services would include things like the DRS, DPM, HA, template management, and host profiles, among others. And these are only available when we have a vCenter server in place. For communication, the vCenter server uses TCP and UDP port 902, and that's for communication with the ESXi host, and it communicates back with our vSphere web client over HTTPS. Okay, let's speak a little bit about the different versions that we have. Before we get into this, I have a PDF here from VMware documentation site. Let me just pull that up. This is the title, so it's called VMware vSphere with Operations Management and VMware vSphere. So this is the license, pricing, and packaging white paper. If we scroll down a bit, I think it's page 8. If we look at this document here, it gives us a fair idea about the different versions of our vCenter server and the capabilities and what version of the vSphere it's included in. Okay, so you guys could always download this and take a look at this. So in a nutshell, for versions, we have two versions, the Essential, and this is included with what VMware market as the Essential Kit, and this would limit you to 3 hosts. So basically you have 6 CPUs total that you could license on this platform. And then we have the standard vCenter server standard, and this would include all the functionality of vSphere with no host limitation. Unlike the Essential Kit where you have 3, this would be unlimited. Okay, so for versions, that's what we have there. In terms of requirements for a vCenter server, let's talk a bit about the hardware requirement, and then we'll move on to some of the software requirements. Depending on what your size of your deployment, both for the vCenterServerAppliance and the Windows-based deployment, which we'll get to in a little bit, depending on that, you would have 3 types of environment settings you could configure during your vCenter server deployment. Okay, so you would have 4 types. So we would have our tiny environment, small environment, medium, and large environment. So you would size your server accordingly based on this. So if you're doing less than 10 hosts and less than 100 VM, you would set up your vCenter server with 2 CPUs, for example, 8 gigs of RAM, Bear in mind though, this has to do just with the vCenter server, not your database, the backend database that's running on this. So if you're running all of that on one box, you would need to cater a little bit more resources for those. Okay, and this is same for the vCenter server on Windows and the vCenter Server Appliance. Okay. In terms of software requirements, you would need a 64-bit operating system. We're talking in more particular here the Windows version of the vCenter server. So you would need a 64-bit operating system, and it should be Windows Server 2008 SP2 and above. And also you would need the logon as a service right for that account that would be managing this. In our testing environment, we'll be running the Windows Server 2012. Okay. So there are a couple different ways of deploying our vCenter server. But before we get into that, I would like to introduce a new topic. This is called Platform Services Controller. This was introduced with vSphere 6.0. We'll need to talk a bit about this before we get into the actual vCenter server deployment. The Platform Services Controller is basically used for running the most common components of VMware products. So basically, most common components would tie into this PSC infrastructure. So it's like a central system for that. So just bear in mind, this is not for vSphere alone. We would deploy the PSC before actually installing the vCenter server. And as you can see, we have two different ways of deploying, or two different deployment types for the PSC. We have the embedded PSC, and then we have the external PSC. We would deploy the embedded PSC. When we deploy the embedded PSC, we are deploying the embedded PSC, the vCenter server, and its components all in one box. So you're basically requiring fewer Windows license if you were thinking about doing the Windows-based vCenter server, or basically less servers overall to manage if you were thinking about the vCenterServerAppliance. Okay. When we deploy the external PSC, the vCenter server and its components, they are all installed on one system, and the actual PSC on another system. Okay. What you could do now is have a load balancer in front of the multiple platform services controller to load balance that traffic there. So I have another PDF here I would like to share with you guys. This one is called the VMware vCenter Server 6.0 Deployment Guide. So if we go all the way at the bottom, I think it's page 88. Oh, and in the appendix, if you look at the bottom here, it describes setting up F5 load balancer to use with this scenario. Okay, so just in case this is something you might be looking at doing in your environment, you could just reference this. All right, so this is the vCenter server deployment guide. Our PSC has multiple components in place. So I would like to just highlight the three of them that we'll be discussing here, the three components of the platform services controller. We'll talk a bit about the single sign-on service, the vSphere license service, and the VMware certificate authority. Okay, so let's start with the SSO. So the SSO is a prerequisite for our vCenter server. We would need to do this. We don't have an option, right? So it's basically a security domain that we're establishing here, kind of like your Windows domain environment. So you create a domain where your vSphere components are registered during installation. Okay, so VMware recommendation is that the domain name be different from your Active Directory domain name. Actually, once you're deploying the vCenterServerAppliance or even the Windows-based installation, you would see a warning on that there. So you wouldn't want to give your vCenter server and this SSO domain the same domain name. Sorry, your Active Directory domain and your SSO domain the same name, okay? In vSphere 6.0, an older version, the default domain name was vSphere. Sorry, in 5.5 downwards, the default domain name was vSphere.local. In 6, you have the option of changing this, and you could use any domain name that you want in that environment. Once we have our SSO domain established, we could authenticate users from multiple vSphere databases or identity sources. You could authenticate users based on the vSphere own database of users and group, the local system, or an external directory like Active Directory, for example. So in a nutshell, the SSO is useful in situations where we'll be managing more than a few hosts. So rather than creating individual user accounts for your user to manage your infrastructure, you could just draw those accounts and groups from a centralized directory, much like Active Directory or some other identity source. Okay, so let's put all of this together. Once we have this deployed, we would point to a web page, or basically point to our vCenter server address where we would log in. So we'll send through a login request there. That login request would be authenticated against one of our identity source. And if that's successful, it would present us with a token that would actually grant us access to our vSphere infrastructure. We'll now discuss the second piece of this, which of our platform services controller, which would be our vSphere license service. Okay, so if we just go back here, recall I mentioned there are three parts of the platform services controller, SSO, and now we'll discuss the license service. We just spoke about this. Yes, so the license service, this provides a common license inventory for all our vCenter systems or other VMware product that is connected to your environment, which is in turn connected to your platform services controller. Okay, so it's just a repository there for all of that. For the third component of the PSC we'll discuss is the VMware Certificate Authority. So the Certificate Authority provides each ESXi host with a signed certificate with itself as the root. So this occurs at the point when we are actually joining the ESXi host or added to our vCenter server. So the certificate store, which is also part of the PSC, is used for storing self-generated and third-party certificates for the vCenter and ESXi in general. Okay. Okay, so here I have highlighted some of the benefits basically of the SSO. We would have discussed these a few minutes ago. So just in a nutshell, I just highlight these here. Okay, so in the next slide, we'll discuss the various types of deployment for vCenter Server. We did mention this a bit earlier in one of the slides that there are two methods of deploying a vCenter Server. You have your Windows-based, you could either do this as a virtual or on a physical machine. And then you have your Linux-based appliance. Okay, so the Windows-based, this use the bundle vPostgres database, and it's recommended for environment with up to 20 hosts and 200 VM. Okay, so this is VMware recommendation. Or you could use an external database there for storing of your data. We'll focus mostly on the Linux-based appliance because this is the direction that VMware is going with this. So for short, we'll just call this the VCSA or the vCenterServerAppliance. So this provides an easy way for us to deploy a vCenter server. Well, not the vCenter server alone, but the vCenter server and the PSC in a pre-configured package, right? So it comes bundled with a lot of smaller services that you may need in your environment. Services like your TFTP server, DHCP, or your auto deploy server. So you can basically deploy all of these services on one server. In the previous versions of the vCenter server, if you were doing, say for example, the Windows-based one, you had to do the auto deploy server separately. So now it's all bundled in one here. It's just a matter of enabling the services like we would have seen previously. So the vCenter Server Appliance, this VMware started support for this from ESXi version 5 and above. Okay. It uses either the embedded vPostgres database or an external Oracle database. You don't have any if your environment requires support for Microsoft SQL Server, that's not an option when you're deploying the vCenter Server Appliance. Okay, so let's just bear that in mind. Okay, let's move on from here. So what's really included with your vCenter Server Appliance? This runs SUSE Linux Enterprise Server 11. We have our Postgres database, and it basically includes the different services that you need to go along with your vCenter server. So your vCenter server and your inventory service and a couple others. Okay, so I have here highlighted some of the main benefits basically of using the appliance over the Windows-based vCenter server. So this first one should be a no-brainer here. So you would eliminate your Windows Server license costs. That would be one of the big reasons you would use that too. You would see later once we deploy these, we'll do like we'll deploy like 3 installations of this, and you'll notice there isn't any change really in the user experience if you're using the vCenter server on your ESXi host, if you're running it there, or if you're running your Windows base. There really isn't any difference in your experience utilizing it. Okay. The embedded database that comes with this, it supports large deployment, I think VMware for this supports, let me see, I think was around 1,000 hosts. 1,000 hosts, I think, with up to 10,000 VM for if you're doing the. Sorry, that's if we're using the Postgres database. We would have up to 1,000 hosts and 10,000 VM. That's a recommendation. Other than that, you would want to run your external Oracle database for this. Okay, and it's really easy to deploy, as we'll see when we move on from here. The next module will cover installation. It's very easy to get the vCenterServerAppliance up and running. Okay, so I want to take a couple minutes and just discuss protection for vCenterServer. When you're deploying the appliance, we will need some way of actually protecting that. Since you recall that runs on that would run virtually and not on a physical box. Okay, we will need to deploy that within our hypervisor. VMware recommendation for this is to use the vSphere High Availability service. We will cover this in the advanced course though. And we'll just go through these couple protection methods that I have listed out here before finishing off with this module. So the vCenterServer Heartbeat. This was a product that VMware used to offer. I just cover it here just in case you would have already got the license for it, or you already own a license for this and you're still running it in your environment. So the Heartbeat is basically to replicate one vCenter server. So say you had that in a virtual environment, it just sync a copy away to another vCenter or another hypervisor, or over to, if you had a physical box, you could sync that over to virtual too. Okay, but this is no longer available from VMware. The recommended method for protecting your virtualized vCenter server is vSphere HA, or the vSphere High Availability. So basically what this would do is, if your vCenter server was to run, say your vCenter server running on one host and that host was to fail, it will automatically just restart that server, or that vCenter server on another host in that cluster. Okay, so we'll cover that, as I mentioned, in our next course. You could also use a converter to create a copy of your vCenter server. So say you have your Windows-based vCenter server and you're running that physically, you could always use your converter to convert that virtually and keep a copy. You could use techniques like cloning and snapshot to make a copy too. Okay, snapshot might be more important than in scenarios where you want to do an update on your vCenter server, some Microsoft update or so you could always create a snapshot before you continue with that. Then again, you could use this method of creating a separate management cluster. So you could host your vCenter server, your databases, and unrelated services. Your PSC, you could host all of that in a separate management cluster away from the environment that this is managing. So you have just this isolate management infrastructure. Okay. Okay, so in our next module, we'll discuss the installation of vCenter server on Windows, and then we'll do a deployment of the vCenterServerAppliance. And also, what I want to do is create or just do a deployment of your vCenterServer appliance on your VMware workstation if you're using a setting like mine for testing, so we could actually get that vCenter server on our VMware workstation and not on an actual host. Okay,